Some Canadian lawmakers are trying to close a loophole, one that allows citizens to get an illegal organ transplant from China. This after an international tribunal says China harvests organs from prisoners of conscience against their will. Here's more.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker.
A group of Canadian lawmakers is pushing for a new bill. It's a measure that fights the practice of forced organ harvesting.
It would make it a criminal offense for a person to go abroad and receive an organ taken without the consent of the person giving the organ.
Controversy surrounding transplant tourism has become a backdrop for the measure. That involves when patients travel to other countries to get organs, oftentimes because it takes too long to find a match in their home country. In the U.S., for example, it takes about 11 months for a liver and more than 3 years for a kidney. Right now, over 100,000 Americans are on the waiting list for an organ transplant. Many patients die waiting. But in China, wait time isn't measured in years, but in days and weeks. In 2020, a hospital in Wuhan found 4 possible heart matches in just 10 days for a female patient. The country has also been known to source organs within 72 hours, or even 24 hours. This information comes from Chinese media reports. In some cases, Chinese hospitals have also promised retransplants, meaning if the quality of an organ isn't up to par, the surgery would be cancelled. The hospital would schedule another transplant within a week. The extremely short wait times have made China one of the top destinations for transplant tourism. But many have been asking a key question: where do the organs come from? Rights activists argue a major source of China's transplant organs is through forced organ harvesting, saying China harvests organs from prisoners of conscience by force, sometimes when they're still alive. In 2018, an international tribunal in London gave its judgment on allegations of forced organ harvesting. The tribunal is made up of renowned medical and legal experts.
It is beyond doubt that forced harvesting of organs happened on a substantial scale and by state-organized or approved organizations and individuals.
Those experts say China's main organ supply comes from Falun Gong practitioners and Uyghurs, members of an ethnic group. Since the allegations have come to light, several countries responded to China's forced organ harvesting. Israel passed a law that prevents insurance reimbursement for illegally obtained organs. Belgium likewise passed a law punishing organ tourism. But in Canada, there is no law that fights organ trafficking, which is why the Canadian lawmakers are pushing for this bill.
And I, too, would like to take this opportunity to recognize the amazing work that was done by the late Member of Parliament, David Kilgour.
The lawmakers also mentioned the bill is in honor of David Kilgour. He's a former cabinet minister and was among the first that brought the issue to light. Back in 2006, when the forced organ harvesting issue first emerged and saw little media coverage, David Kilgour investigated the practice with another rights lawyer named David Mattis. The two later published an investigative report.
We pursued every investigative trail we could find. In the report, you will see that there are 18 different avenues of proof and disproof we considered and evaluated. Our bottom line conclusion, after considering everything as best we could, was that the allegations are true. We believe them to be true, that this harvesting is indeed happening.
They were nominated for the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize. Kilgour passed away last week of a rare lung disease. He was 81.
It's a shame that he didn't live to see its passage, but I certainly hope that this bill will pass.
Following the investigative report, Kilgour kept raising awareness about the issue.
David Mattis and I have been in about 50 countries talking about it, and we will continue to talk about it, as all people of goodwill will, until it stops. There's only one country out of, I guess, almost 200 countries in the world now that does this on an industrial, state-sponsored level, and that's China.
What's more, he wrote a book called Bloody Harvest, The Killing of Falun Gong for Their Organs.
He is the one that blew the doors open on this practice overseas and that made this thing possible.
David brought this issue to my attention. He brought this issue to many people's attention. He wrote the initial report along with David Matas on this issue and has just been a tireless champion on it, but on so many other human rights issues as well.
As for the bill, it passed the Canadian Senate last year and is now before the Canadian House of Commons.
A first for Taiwan's military. The island's defense force released a civil defense handbook for the first time on Tuesday. The handbook gives citizens survival guidance in a case of a war scenario. A Taiwan defense official further explained, saying the handbook provides information on how citizens should react during a military crisis and possible disasters to come. As the Russia-Ukraine war continues, the island is getting more attention, specifically how it should respond to Beijing's increasing pressure. Beijing claims the island as part of mainland China, though the island is governed by its own democratic constitution and leadership. Even still, China has never ruled out using force to control Taiwan and has stepped up military activities surrounding the island in the past 2 years. Taiwan's handbook details how to find shelter and supplies and offers tips for preparing emergency first aid kits. It uses comic strips and pictures to illustrate those details. Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen is overseeing a broad modernization program to strengthen the island's forces. According to plans unveiled last year, Taiwan plans to reform training for its reserve forces. What's more, the government is looking to extend compulsory military service for citizens beyond the current 4-month requirement.
China could be backing off on one of its most ambitious policies. It's called Common Prosperity. Beijing said the plan was to tackle income inequality. So why the change of heart? NTD's Don Ma has more.
Is Xi Jinping walking back a key Chinese policy? The phrase common prosperity was everywhere in China in 2021. It appeared in state media, schools, and speeches by Xi. But this year, mentions of it seem to wane. It turned up just once in a 17,000-word report by the CCP premier. So has Beijing given up on its common prosperity policy? Political scientist and economic analyst Ethan Yang says Xi won't walk back on the policy.
Well, Xi Jinping is up for re-election in November. And so I think that's one of the big things on his mind is that he cannot go into the election stage admitting that he's failed on probably one of the most ambitious economic policies he's ever announced. And perhaps he can take his foot off the gas pedal a little bit.
So what is common prosperity? In a nutshell, it's Xi Jinping's way of tackling income inequality. It's a tool for him to reorganize China's economy. A real-world example of common prosperity is the massive regulatory fines on big Chinese tech companies, Alibaba, for example. So why is Xi Jinping taking his foot off the gas pedal on common prosperity?
So I think they're backing off primarily because investors are losing confidence. What happened was the Chinese stock market tanked tremendously right after that because of these huge regulatory fines, but also because investors saw that, and they saw that the Chinese regulatory environment is going to become more politicized and less coherent based on standard economic theories. So I think the Chinese government knows that. They understand that that's a problem.
What was the reason for the regulatory crackdown? Yang says it was part of the common prosperity policy that sought to help boost small businesses in China.
That allows smaller companies to rise up and create more diversity in the economy, more competition. It doesn't work because a government doesn't really know what companies are going to be successful, what companies are not going to be successful. And so basically it's just someone's opinion rather than the economic reality.
According to Yang, common prosperity has similarities to central planning policies, which failed in the 20th century.
Amid China's strict lockdown rules, a postgraduate student from Shandong province has caught the public eye. That's through his efforts to uphold freedom of speech. We spoke to him for more details.
Postgraduate student Sun Jian got kicked out of his university for protesting the local COVID-19-driven lockdown. How did he protest? By simply holding a sign and walking around campus under half an hour. NTD's Chinese language channel interviewed him over the phone.
The fundamental reason is I oppose the university's lockdown policies.
He explained how the campus for the Ludong University, where he studies, has been under partial lockdown for the majority of nearly the last 2 years. Under those rules, students are allowed to move freely within the campus but not leave the premises.
They don't care whether there are local positive cases or not. Ludong University has always been, or to say most of the time, under lockdown. That's very disturbing for students for going out.
Soon insists the necessity of lockdown is negotiable, defends his actions as protecting freedom of speech.
I made a banner on March 27th, put Lift the Bar in Ludong University on the front, and 4 statements on the back. Number 1, I strongly oppose campus lockdown. Number 2, I strongly oppose such frequent massive tests. Number 3, I strongly oppose such severe control on students. And 4 is I oppose the universities putting pandemic control above all other priorities.
He said a professor began to follow him just 2 or 3 minutes after he began holding the sign on campus. Soon after, 3 others joined in monitoring him. They later grabbed his sign and called the police. He was able to hold the sign for just 20 minutes. He told Chinese NTD that in order not to put others in trouble, he asked a stranger to take a short video of him holding the banner. Despite warnings from both the police and the university, he still posted a video clip of the protest to any social media platforms he could reach. The university officially expelled him last Friday, accusing him of seriously disrupting campus management order and seriously damaging the school's reputation. But soon decided to fight back and insist he didn't do anything illegal. At the same time, he shared an open letter he wrote to the school. The letter reads, "If you think getting rid of me is easier than getting rid of the problems, then I tell you here today, your plan will not work on me." He also reiterates his determination to fight and closes the letter by saying, "My purpose is to let people know, you and me, who is the barbaric one and who is the civilized one."
And in Washington, D.C. today, India's defense minister visited the Pentagon for strategic talks just after President Biden spoke with India's prime minister. India has held a neutral stance on the Russian invasion and is still importing Russian oil. The Biden administration is working to deepen its relations with India to build a stronger opposition against both Russia and China. But how is India reacting? NTD's Melina Wisecup has the details.
The U.S. and India are both supporting Ukraine with humanitarian assistance, but as for how to hold Russia accountable for this invasion, the two countries are not on the same page. In a virtual meeting at the White House today, President Biden urged India's prime minister to take a tough stance on Russia.
The United States and India are going to continue our close consultation on how to manage the destabilizing effects of this Russian war.
India is still importing Russian oil and abstained from voting to remove Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. The countries called for independent investigations into the killings in Ukraine.
I spoke several times on the phone to the presidents of both Ukraine and Russia. I not only appealed for peace, but also suggested that there be direct talks between President Putin and the president of Ukraine.
But Russia is not the only country at the top of discussion between the two countries.
The People's Republic of China is attempting to challenge and undermine the sovereignty of its neighbors. Beijing is eroding the security of the Indo-Pacific region from its construction of dual-use infrastructure along your border to its unlawful claims in the South China Sea.
India's defense minister did not directly comment on China or Russia. Defense Secretary Austin welcomed India's defense minister to the Pentagon today for strategic discussions about how to strengthen their defense partnership to maintain peace and security in the Indo-Pacific. And China has ramped up its military posture in the South China Sea. China is also accelerating its nuclear weapons buildup. The Wall Street Journal reports that more than 100 suspected missile launch facilities were uncovered in China's western region this year. And analysts say these facilities could be used to store nuclear-tipped missiles that are capable of reaching the U.S.
Next, we'd like to address one of our audience's frequently asked questions. Some have written to us wondering why the Chinese Communist Party persecutes Falun Gong, a spiritual meditation practice. The Chinese regime has been persecuting Falun Gong, also known as Falun Dafa, for 23 years, since summer 1999. Those who practice the system are abducted, imprisoned, detained in labor camps, tortured, and even suffer forced organ harvesting. Their deaths are largely known to supply China's booming organ transplant market. But why did Beijing launch the persecution campaign? Before it began, Falun Gong saw wild popularity throughout China, spread through word of mouth. At its peak, 100 million people were practicing there, a number higher than the Communist Party's membership roster. The party views any group bigger than itself as a threat to its rule. On top of that, Falun Gong teaches the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance, and puts importance on improving moral character. These values differ greatly from what the regime stands for. Top party authorities fear that if many people follow Falun Gong's principles, they will reject the CCP, as well as its communist ideology and state-sanctioned atheism. Despite that thinking, Falun Gong has no political goals and doesn't belong to a political party. The meditation practice is one of what Chinese tradition calls energy practices or Qigong practices. Dozens of energy practices are banned in China. Other forms of spirituality are also suppressed, including religious beliefs like Christianity and Buddhism.